You can kind of work on your poster for conference.
And now we hope the Zoom people will hear us. Is that your computer? Okay. I think we're ready to go. Any other announcements or anything? All right, we will turn then the rest of our time over to Dr. Sudweeks, who will share with us about self-report skills. And so we don't have a lot of opportunities to learn measurement or evaluation ideas in this in the program unless we're in the evaluation courses. So we want to have him come occasionally and share some insight to us that will help us all out in our programs and many of the fashions we're in. So if you'll please join me in welcoming Dr. Sudweeks to our program.
Can you hear me in the back, Stephen? Right. I appreciate this opportunity to be with you. Part of IP&T, but I'm also the IME doctoral program. Spend most of my time with those students. Of our classes. IP&T classes. So I want to talk today about some measurement issues. We're only going to have effective instruction. We need to be able to reliably and validly measure the outcomes of that instruction. So I'm going to focus on some of those outcomes today. I won't be talking very much about cognitive outcomes. Those, maybe you've taken the course from Dr. Davies where he focuses on developing tests to measure achievement, what students have learned in terms of cognitive knowledge. I'm going to be talking about other kinds of measures today. And we'll give you an example, and we'll also more about that. So I want to begin with this question. You see that word construct? Give me a definition of what a construct is. This is how I define it. Heavily influenced by the literature on this topic. So construct is an internal attribute. It's something inside of me. It's either an attribute or a characteristic of individuals that we humans create in our mind when we theorize about consistencies and differences that we observe in our own behavior or in the behaviors of other people. Here are some examples. Curiosity, shyness, aggressiveness, and one that maybe you're familiar with at the bottom. Maybe you have some personal experience there. These are all constructs. Scholars often create constructs. Wait a minute, I think I went too far. Yeah, I did. Psychologists and sociologists make constructs. So do economists, so do political scientists, so do people in almost any social science field. They also exist in other fields. Physical sciences. Maybe you learned about gravity once in second grade. It's a construct. So here's some examples: intelligence, self-esteem, self-efficacy, narcissism, neuroticism, test anxiety. I don't suspect you've ever experienced that. Test anxiety, there's two kinds of test anxiety. Some kinds are facilitative, other kinds get in the way. What would be an example of facilitative test anxiety?
I would think like maybe anxiety or stress that makes you more alert, maybe like more conscientious about checking your work.
Yeah. So you know you've got a test coming up. have a little anxiety about that. So you spend some extra time, some extra effort. It's an example of facilitative test anxiety. On the other hand, it can also be debilitating. Metacognitive awareness is a good example of a construct that's a good one for college students to attain. There are some people who have developed measures of metacognitive awareness for little kids, third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders. Quite common to teach this construct to high school students. Can I mention it? Now, I've only given you a short list of examples here. I want you to know that academic scholars are not the only ones who create and use constructs. Observant parents do. You might find it interesting sometime to go to a city park in the daytime, in the summer. See if you see any mothers there with their children. Children will be busy playing, and the mothers will be talking about constructs that they observe in their kids. Teachers and educators have constructs. Analysts and sportcasters make them up all the time. You even find constructs in the New Testament. You've probably heard of hypocrisy. Meekness is in the Sermon on the Mount. You know, there's a parable about the prodigal son. You had a problem with prodigalness, the construct. So you don't have to be a social scientist to develop constructs. But what about constructs? What about the nature of them? They're not directly observable. What we see is manifestations of them, indicators of them. And because we see those indicators of consistent behavioral patterns in kids or differences in consistencies from one child to another, then we develop these constructs. But they're hypothetical. They're theoretical. They exist in our heads. They have to be inferred from behavioral consistencies we observe within persons and differences between persons. Since they're not directly observable, scholars often refer to them as latent traits. The word latent simply means not directly observable. And sometimes they're called factors. In a sense, those three terms are synonymous. Construct, latent traits, factor. Now, notice what it says on the right-hand side here. Even though these abstract concepts are not directly observable, they're presumed to exist, and they're presumed to influence the way people behave. Jesus accused the Pharisees of behaving in certain ways because of their hypocrisy. Collectively, such attributes are called latent traits, but they have to be inferred. Now, if you're going to develop a way of measuring one of these constructs, first thing you've got to do is find what it is, to pin it down, to differentiate it from other constructs. And you better have some theory in mind, some ideas in mind. And you need to find out what existing scales are already available and what their strengths and weaknesses are. I'm working right now with 3 students. Develop a measure of intellectual humility. You know, one of the occupational hazards of being a professor is that sometimes professors are not, well, they're arrogant sometimes. Intellectual humility is a little scarce. And college students tend to pick up on that and learn it themselves. Understand what I'm talking about? Well, look what it says. Number 3, you should find out what existing skills are available. In fact, there's about a half a dozen scales of intellectual ability. Some of them include Elvin's perspective. So we're trying to develop a humility scale that reflects that LDS point of view as well as their points of view. We're trying to learn from what's already been done. And that's an important step. Now, to get a clear definition of the trait you're trying to measure, you often need to use some qualitative methods. Helps to do some observations. Observe people's behavior, different circumstances. You might want to do some interviews. Why do they act that way? Why do they do what they do? You might want to do some case studies. You especially want to learn from the published literature. And you want to learn from efforts that people have already made to develop similar scales. I must have put my finger there. Notice number 3 here and 4. If you don't do an adequate job of reviewing the previous research, you might find yourselves reinventing the wheel. Even worse, you might reinvent a flat tire. So, once you've defined the trait that you're trying to focus on, you know how it differs from other traits and how you want to define it. Then you need to start thinking about, well, if this is a latent trait, if it's unimprovable, what kind of behaviors would be manifestations of it? In other words, what are you willing to accept as evidence that somebody has this particular trait? Or that some people have more of it and other people have less of it? Are you willing to accept the evidence of that? You've got to think clearly about that. Notice at the bottom, factor analysis and item response theory provide ways to assess how well a set of items function as manifest indicators. So we want to develop some items, but then we want to get people to respond to them. And we want to do some statistical analysis to test our assumptions. Now look, suppose you wanted to develop a measure of honesty. You might say to yourself, well, if we show up part of lying behaviors, or cheating behaviors, or stealing behaviors. But then you've got to ask yourself, oh, well, how will I know when people are lying? You got to have some items, some behavioral indicators of that. You need some behavioral indicators of here, of cheating, and you need some behavioral indicators of here. But some of these kinds of evidence you might focus on might turn out to not be very reliable or valid indicators. So you got to try it out. Now, I'm going to focus today developing self-report measures, these kind of latent traits. There are strengths and weaknesses of taking that approach. People might not honestly report their dishonesty. Understand what I'm saying? So we can take some procedures there to help too. But we might not want to rely solely on self-report. We might want to get some other measures too. But in the time I've got today, I'm going to focus on self-report. After all, Dr. Leary knows Dr. Leary better than anybody else. She knows when she's being dishonest or not. If she's willing to report it, that would be one source we'd want to rely on. Yeah. Maybe we want to talk to her neighbors too, or her family. They might be a source of evidence we'd want to use. I'm going to focus today on self-report. Before we do, we need to ask ourselves some questions about the purpose of the instrument. Why is that instrument needed? Who's the target audience of intended respondents? Measure this latent variable among preschoolers, kindergartners, or middle schoolers, or high schoolers, or college students, or adults, or who else? And who will likely use the results, and for what purpose? What kind of decisions are intended to inform? How will this instrument contribute to research or to improve practice? Those are all questions we want to get answers to up front. And then, what kinds or types of items are we going to use? If this is a self-report instrument, we're going to have some questions for people to respond to, or some statements for them to respond to, or some problems or tasks for them to do. But we better have a rationale for believing why those items will be valid indicators of the construct. Now, let me stop at this point and let's do a little example. I'm going to ask you to respond honestly to a self-report instrument. Now, this was developed about 7 years ago. And it's intended to measure an interesting construct called picky eating behavior. Some of you may be more picky than others in terms of what you eat and what you won't eat and what behaviors you engage in when you're eating. So I want you to take a few minutes, read each of these statements, and then respond by marking one of the 5 categories that are right. Be honest. You're not going to be graded on this. Nobody else is going to see the results. This is just one example of a possible self-report.
I never have one with me. That's who it was. Anybody else need a writing utensil?
I'll take it.
Thank you, Heather. I want you to get one to Dr. Rick. Scale too. Dr. West. Whether they need some pencils.
You guys need writing utensil?
Now, if we're going to use this as a measure, we have to have some way of scoring it. One way to do that would be to add up the total of number one you have in the first column of ones, add up the total of those ones. Then take the total of the twos and multiply it by 2. And take the total of the 3s and multiply by 3, and the total of 4s and multiply by 4, and the total of 5s and multiply by 5. But that's not how the authors intended this to be used. Another way to report the results would be to simply create a frequency distribution for each item. So you might say on item number 1, 7% answered never, 20% answered rarely, 25% answered sometimes. And you do that for each option. I often see that as a way of reporting the results of this kind of instrument. That is not a smart thing to do. Even though it's sometimes done, that's a cop-out. The intent here, of a self-report scale, is to get a number that represents where you are on a continuum from a very picky eater to a not very picky eater, somewhere along that continuum. But in this particular case, when the authors developed it, they made an instrument that measured 4 different factors. Now you see my diagram up here for honesty. They would put picky eating right here. Over here, they would put meal presentation. Draw a line under the first 7 items. Those 7 items are supposed to measure meal presentation. The next 4, items 8 through 11, are intended to measure food variety. The next 3, items 12 through 14, are intended to measure meal disengagement. And the other 2 are supposed to measure taste aversion. Now, notice they had at least 2 items for every factor. A single item doesn't make a factor. In fact, usually 2 items don't make a very good factor. But they've got one with only 2 items. So if you're going to compute a score, you should compute a score for each of those factors. Right? Now, what about computing a composite score across all 4 factors? Well, that depends upon to what extent these factors are intercorrelated. See, in their case, they've got 4 across here and perhaps 1 up here. If you've got 4 across here, or 3 or 4, and they're highly correlated, then maybe you would be justified in saying, oh, they all measure a higher order factor. That's a question you have to answer statistically before you would do that. Let me pause here for a minute and give you an example. Last year, two colleagues in the School of Education, I guess it was more than a year, it was 2 years ago. Because one of those colleagues was Richard Osgathorpe, who was the dean. We developed a scale to measure teachers, elementary school teachers' confidence in their ability to teach morally. Notice I didn't say to teach morality, I said to teach in a moral way. We had 3 factors. And we found that these two were correlated at 0.87, and those two were correlated at 0.93, and the first and the third one was correlated about 0.89. That's good evidence that you don't have discriminant validity, that people can't tell them apart. So then we ask ourselves, oh, well, maybe they're all one factor. You can test that. When we tested it, we found that they weren't all one. Then we said, oh, well, is there a higher order factor like we've got here? Yeah, there was. These are all questions you can answer, and they have to do with validity, how you interpret the result, what the results mean. You have to do a factor analysis to answer that. Am I making sense so far? Do you have questions? By the way, who's the pickiest eater?
I don't know how to total this up, so I wouldn't.
I'm less picky than I thought I would be. Still plenty picky.
Still. So how'd you do, Heather?
I'm not too much of a picky.
Lowest. Anyone lower than an average of 2? Is anyone on a?
My experience is,
Calculate the average.
I'm not sure how valid what I'm gonna say. My limited experience is that men are more picky eaters than women. I don't know why. You have a reason for that?
No, but my opinion is that children are pickier eaters than adults.
Well, that's true. That's definitely true. You might want to administer this.
I'm like, can I have extra copies and take these home?
I'm a culinary student.
I know, I haven't, yeah.
I'll get you a copy.
Awesome.
So we're collecting data, not just for the purpose of collecting data, but it's got to be useful for some purpose. Academics, we want to use it for research purposes often. So we particularly want to be concerned about doing it right, getting valid and reliable results. That just doesn't happen. So I want to go on here. Notice the kind of items we can use in this case. What are they? Are they questions? Are they statements or what? Picky eating question here.
Statement.
Statements. And you're asked to respond on a frequency continuum. That continuum is a rating scale, consists of ordered categories of how often you do something. But you could have a different kind of continuum right here. Could be a frequency continuum, or you could ask people, how well do you do something, from not very well to very effectively on the other end of the continuum. Or a competence continuum, how competent are you doing something? From not at all confident to extremely confident. Or you can give people statements and ask them to what extent they agree or disagree. That is an example of what's called a Likert scale. Write this name down, Likert. That's the name of a scholar at the University of Michigan in the 1930s. His first name was Rensis. His last name was Likert. And he was a very good psychometrician, and He was concerned that the existing ways of measuring attitudes and affective variables was too cumbersome. It had been developed by Louis Thurston. So Likert developed an easier way, and it became very popular. It's widely used today. You give people statements and then you simply ask them to what extent they agree or disagree. Notice I've used the name Likert. That's the way he pronounced his name. People who don't know any better call it Likert. You know better now. It only has one K, but it's not Likert. He did not like to be called Likert.
Read that.
I gotta go back here. Now look. Notice this. This is called the domain map. This is an example we used before I came to BYU. I was working at Syracuse University in upstate New York. And I was asked by one of the deans on campus to develop a way of measuring people's anxiety towards mathematics, towards studying and learning math. There were a number of, there were about 3 existing scales of math anxiety. But the dean said, they're all correlated with test anxiety. And I'm not trying to measure test anxiety. I want to measure anxiety towards learning math. So we did a literature search and we couldn't find any that were highly correlated with test anxiety. So he said, well, make one. So we did. But in order to do that, you need to start with a map of how you conceptualize the domain. Please notice I've got 3 rows. Verbalized feelings of distress and discomfort, avoidance behaviors, impaired performance, and then 2 columns. This was a column about studying and learning math, situations when you're expected to do that, and situations when you're expected to use your knowledge of math. So I sat down with 2 graduate students over a period of days, with about 72 items that measured different cells in that 3x2 matrix. When you write items, you need to have that kind of a domain map in mind. You need to make sure that you represent all 6 of those cells. You follow what I'm saying? By the way, later when we tried it out, we found out some of our items didn't work. Most importantly, we found that those 2 columns were highly correlated and we didn't need them both. We could collapse into one. But it was very important for us to sample all 3 of those rows. Well, you need that kind of content map clearly in your mind when you're writing the items. Now, what kind of map would these folks have had that wrote the picky eating one? They would have had 4 rows, 1 for each of those factors. With me? They may have only had 1 column. Now, in terms of response options, you need to ask yourself, do I need a middle category? People have debated that since Likert's time in 1930. And the best answer today is no. Usually don't want a middle category. Today you can statistically test that. Most of the time people find out they don't need a middle category and people just use it as a cop-out anyway. But then there's the question of how many options. People tend to like to say, well, I want to get some variance. So they put 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11. Most people can't make that fine of distinction in their minds. I wouldn't use more than 7. My experience is often when I've used 7, I could really collapse it into 4 or 5.
Albert Bandura suggested 100-point scales.
Albert Bandura, who developed the self-efficacy measure, said you should have 100 response categories. He was not a statistician. Now, I don't want to downplay the efforts that Bandura made. He was a Stanford scholar. In 2009, some colleagues and I on this campus developed a measure of self-efficacy. We used 11 categories and we had to collapse them. People can't make that fine a distinction. We didn't follow Bandura to 100. 11 didn't even work, let alone 100. Peter's right, Bandura wanted 100, but it doesn't work. So how are you gonna score it? Are you gonna use summated scores, or are you gonna weight them somehow? And if you got multiple factors, you better have a single score for each factor. Separate. Now, we need to try the instrument out. And you ought to have several hundred respondents. The exact number depends upon how many factors you have, how many items you have. You ought to have at least 5 times as many items as you have. 5 times as many respondents, in other words, persons as you do items, at least that. Then I would use exploratory factor analysis to find out which items load on which factors and how many factors there are. You may have thought you had 3, but there might only be 2. You may have thought you had 5, and there might only be 2. Exploratory factor analysis will tell you that. Then once you've answered that question, you know how many factors, then you can do the confirmatory part. That's the real test. But notice I've also said you could use item response theory. That allows you to find out how the options function. Robert Bandura didn't go very far. He would have known, he would have found out right away that it needed to collapse, but you can also find out, do the options function differently across demographic groups? Like this picky eating one. Do the options function differently for males than they do for females? Or probably do function differently for young children than they do for older people. You can answer that question. Response theory. Then you need to estimate reliability. There's a tendency for people to say, oh, I'm going to use Cronbach's alpha. That's easy to use because you only have to give the instrument once. You don't have to give it to the same people twice to get a test-retest coefficient. You administer that to one group of people on one occasion. Cronbach's alpha assumes 3 things. First of all, it assumes that all the items measure the same trait. So in the picky eating questionnaire, there are 4 different traits. You need to compute a Cronbach's alpha for each of those factors separately. Cronbach's alpha won't work to measure all the items as one. You can do it, but it will underestimate the reliability if you do. There are 2 other assumptions, and I'm not going to talk about them because I'm running out of time. If you can't use Cronbach's alpha, then use McDonald's. That's easy to use based on the results of your factor analysis. The factor analysis you compute that statistic. Then you want to collect evidence of validity. Factor analysis will give you initial evidence of the internal structure. That's one. Another will be based on test content. If you started with one of those domain maps and you had defensible rows and columns in that map, that builds content validity into the instrument. Now, at this point, you'd get some experts to review it and see how well your items reflect that map. You might also want to correlate scores with other variables. would be evidence of validity also. This is a sales pitch. You want to learn more about how to do this kind of thing? There are 5 different courses or 6 that you can take, all 6. And I would especially encourage you, if you're going to develop a scale, to take the first 2 classes. The third one would also be useful. All right, now what questions do you have? Would you like to- Yes.
This is more just about the classes, but I know that some of these require prerequisites in order to take it. Is that just the 745? Is the
You have
750
to take this one before this,
before measurement?
and it helps to take this one before that. From there, well, you gotta take this one before that. But you don't have to take any of those.
But 745, you have to take the stats 1 and 2.
So this handout summarizes the ideas that I've tried to present today, and it also gives you on the second list of references where you can read. Other questions? I hope this has been helpful and useful to you.
You know, a lot of this is extremely helpful for the academic side of research. What do you think would be similar or maybe different in instructional design and maybe even like corporate side of things, like let's say for user experience for a tech company that leads related trainings?
So if you're developing instruction for a client, and the client wants evidence that your instruction makes a difference, then you can ask yourself, well, what are the outcomes that my instruction is intended to produce? Well, maybe those are cognitive outcomes. Or maybe there are skills outcomes. Then you might want to develop a performance assessment. If they're skills outcomes, if they're cognitive outcomes, then you want to develop a cognitive test. But if you're measuring a latent variable of some kind, then this would be a useful way to go. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that helps.
Yes.
How many items do you find you can include before people get burned out or apathetic about the task?
I don't know a solid answer to that. When I graduated from BYU, I applied for a job with the federal government. They asked me to take they flew me back to Washington. They were going to give you some tests. Well, they gave me one of the tests was the Minnesota Basic Personality Info. Did I say that right, Stephen? 750 items. Took all morning. Then they called me back the next day and wanted to interview me because they said, "We understand you were a Mormon missionary." Yes. Where did you? Canada and Minnesota. We understand that missionaries are not allowed to date. Is that right? Yeah. Even you went 2 years without date. They didn't believe what I'd said.
Broke their
The
instrument.
750 items had one scale, the L scale that measured light. I did okay on that one. That didn't mean I had a high lying score. That means I had a low lying score. I don't know the answer to that, but that's an important concern. And it's going to depend, upon the age level of people you're administering it to. It's going to depend on their interest. So I don't know a definitive answer. Reasonable question to ask. Other questions? Well, I better let you go to dinner.
All right, let's thank Dr. Sudweeks. We appreciate you spending some time with us this afternoon. Let's go get something to eat and we'll be back again noon next week with our